So if you're anything like me, you're probably a bit of a JRPG fanatic. Which would also mean that if you were watching the Xbox showcase this past weekend, you too were probably pleasantly surprised to see a trailer that I can only explain as a Western-style JRPG announced and shown for the first time. And that game is Clair Obscur Expedition 33. And sorry for butchering the name is definitely French. So since this game interested me so much, it kind of made me want to do a trailer deep dive like I have done in the past with Final Fantasy XVI trailers. Before we get going, I just want to throw in a disclaimer. This video will go frame by frame through the trailer and we will look at the website. This is all information that they've readily shared. And in my opinion, I don't think it really gets into spoiler territory, more just speculation territory and confirmation of some gameplay mechanics. If that is too much for you, then feel free to click off. But I don't think that there's a huge risk of this ruining the game for you. With that out of the way, this is going to be a long video, so let's get right into it. The opening shot of the trailer sets the tone for the game, which is very French and very fantastical. You can see what is best described as a flaccid Eiffel Tower with something growing on it. There's a broken Arc de Triomphe in the foreground and some floating islands in the background. This scene tells us for sure that the game is set in what was once France, but obviously something strange has happened to the world. The scene changes, and again we see a broken Arc de Triomphe, as well as a group of people around what looks like a fountain from Versailles. In the background we see what looks like either a large tree or maybe a column with the number 34 adorning it. There's a few details here that I think are somewhat interesting. For starters, we can see that the sun is eclipsed, but interestingly, the scene is being illuminated from the upper right portion of the screen. This could just be an artistic choice, but it does look like there's another light somewhere in the sky in the upper right. And I wonder if this is a second sun or just a random lighting element that they're using to illuminate the scene. And I'm going to explain this later, but for now, just know that the relationship between light and dark is going to be a core theme of this game. You can kind of see traces of it here with how they portray the numbers on this dark stump and the solar eclipse behind it with that ring of light. But just know, as we go through this trailer and as you kind of look scene by scene with me, look out for these interesting scenes with very stark contrast between light and dark. And so moving ahead, we see the paintress, as she's named by the narrator, changing the number on the pillar from 34 to 33. The narrator in this case is someone that people familiar with this channel should recognize as Ben Starr, the voice for Clive Rossfield in Final Fantasy XVI. Presumably, Ben is the voice actor for Gustav, the main male lead in this game too. The next section of the trailer is characterized by the narrator basically explaining the premise of the story of the game. To summarize, once a year the paintress awakes and counts the number down on the pillar, and then magically all the people who are that age die all at once. So in this case, all of the 33-year-olds on Earth died when the number counted down. And now I'm going to break the order of this video slightly just to make things easier to talk about. You see, the devs have actually shown the names for most of the main characters in this trailer, and just to make things easier to talk about, I'm going to go over the characters and their descriptions now, just so I can say their names in the trailer and save some time. They seem to have updated the website, so I'm not sure if you can find it again yourself, but what I'm going to show is really super service level descriptions of the characters with their names. If you don't want to see that, then you can skip ahead. Just understand that I will use their names going forward. So the male lead, who I again think is narrating and is Ben Starr, is named Gustav, and he was an engineer. Then there's Loon, who is a scholar and a mage, Ciel, who is a farmer turned teacher turned warrior, and Mael, who was an orphan and the shy loner of the group. Those are all the characters of the cast that they've disclosed so far. So now, heading back to the trailer, we can see Gustav standing with what we can assume to be either his wife or girlfriend who is crying. Then, after a moment together, the woman turns to dust as Gustav is forced to watch. Obviously, it's implied that the woman here is 33 years old and Gustav is a year younger since he's about to leave on the expedition. Then we cut to what looks like a market street that is filled with people and white and red flowers. After a moment, most of the people on the street disappear except a few in the foreground. I think the most important thing in the scene is likely the flowers, but I'm not a botanist, so if you know what those flowers are and what they could represent, please let me know. But for now, I'm going to assume that these are likely funeral flowers, given the circumstances, since all of the characters in this world know that this is about to happen. So now after the people die, we see flower petals floating on the wind, and the scene cuts to Gustav and Mael. We get a clearer look at Gustav and see that he seems to have what looks like a magical prosthetic left arm, and all the characters have these white bands tied around their arms. This seems to mark them as members of the expedition, which I think is supported by this next scene where we see a large group of people together, seemingly setting up to go out on this expedition. Also in the background, you can see what looks like an ocean with a few boats in the water, and over the ocean is the paintress's pillar. I mean, this is also confirmed by the narrator saying every year the expedition departs for the continent, which implies that the place they currently live is on an island. Since we know that modern Paris is nowhere near the ocean, and certainly not an island, This then further implies that something drastic happened to the world, which isn't really explained and something that I'm sure this game will explore. After this, the trailer cuts to a bunch of landscapes, which show off the great art direction for this game. There really isn't a lot to talk about here. It's mostly fantasy landscapes with some weird blurry sections and also what looks like maybe some enemies in the distance. But overall, I don't think there's a lot to glean from this section of the trailer, so let's move ahead. We now see Gustav in a red lit room with what looks like a pile of bodies in the background. I think that this might be the result of prior expeditions. The other possibility is, as I mentioned earlier, the current civilization seems to live on an island in what was once Paris. These bodies could be people who weren't fortunate enough to live in Paris in the area that became the island and was safe for monsters. In this next scene, we see Gustav, Mael, and Loon in a room with Loon talking to someone off screen. And a quick note, since this is our first time seeing Loon, you can see that she actually has a prosthetic right arm, much like the left arm that Gustav has. It's a very curious coincidence, and I wonder if there's some sort of connection there. Anyway, we then see who Loon is talking to, which is this faceless husk that seems to be floating. Since she's talking to it, it would imply that it's somehow sentient, but right now there really isn't much to say what it could even be. A spirit of the dead, a monster that gains sentience, who knows? But I think it is obviously going to be important to the story. We then see the player controlling Loon, which basically confirms that the player will be able to control all party members in the overworld, which means there will be multiple party leaders throughout the game. Loon is again walking through these fantastical landscapes before cutting to a scene of what looks like Loon and Mael having an argument. With the way that they cut the trailer, it sounds like we can hear what the argument is, but of course this could just be trailer magic. What Maeve is supposedly saying at this time is "we walk with death," while the duo appears to be in a battlefield. You can see in the background there's a person impaled on a giant sword, so you get the impression that maybe they are scarred or horrified by what they're seeing. And maybe Maeve feels that this is just an unwinnable situation, as there's just death everywhere. Now the trailer cuts to the player controlling Maeve, as she appears to be running up to a boss in a giant coliseum. The boss looks really cool, but there's not a whole lot to see here. We are now introduced to the fourth character that I mentioned earlier, Ciel, as her character talks. Again, we switch perspective to the player controlling Ciel, and we can see her run up to a monster. Right before she reaches the monster, we jump cut to the juicy bit, the combat. As I said earlier, this game has turn-based combat, but it also has inputs during both yours and your opponent's moves, which makes it feel a little more actiony than your standard turn-based JRPG. We start off with a prompt to press A as the start of an attack, and we can see a diamond around the prompt that is ticking down. You can also see there is a yellow section of the timer, and once the timer reaches the yellow zone, it disappears and the word perfect pops up. So from this, we can obviously glean that it isn't just about pressing the buttons as they appear like a QTE, but it's also about timing your button presses, more like a rhythm game. Now looking away from the center of the screen, we can see a large enemy and a health bar at the top of the screen with the enemy name Borgian. You can see the number 852 between the boss's legs with a green leaf next to it, which I think pretty obviously represents the damage that we did to the boss, as well as the type of damage, which would be nature damage. You can also see on the right side of the health bar, the number 852 also shows up there. There's also some sort of yellow bar below the boss's HP, which my first thought coming from Final Fantasy is it looks like a stagger gauge, but obviously it could be anything. Also, on the left, you can see the turn order, where we can see Loon, Mael, the boss, and Gustav taking their turns. In the bottom right, you can see what looks like the character portraits with their health bars, and some sort of resource below the health bar, which I will call mana for now. You can also see that Mael is stanceless, which the other two characters don't have. The next section shows a bunch of combat, so I will try to go fast and only point out the differences as they pop up. Now, in the next scene, we have Mael attacking. The only thing interesting here is that we can see that the characters have over 22,000 HP, so that indicates that 100,000 might be the cap. We can also see that the mana seems to cap out at 9, since it doesn't look like there's any more room below the health bar for more mana. The next scene, we have Gustav, and we can see the turn-based combat menu. We see attack, which would be the basic attack, skills, items, and aim, which we will see later is him using his gun. We also see flee and skip turn options in the bottom left. Also, for a moment, you can see a blue number 1 pop up next to Gustav's head. I think this might represent a mana recharge for turn, so he recharged 1 mana this turn. We then see the player select skills, and a new menu pops up. The first attack does lightning damage based on the number of charges. The second attack does physical damage and generates charges guaranteed on criticals. And the final attack attack applies a mark. My assumption here is that Gustav does lightning damage, and he can mark enemies to increase critical chance, and hitting criticals obviously gives you the charges for you to do big damage. The other interesting thing is on the right you can see the player can press R2 and access another menu. This menu isn't really explained right now, but to me it seems to attach modifiers to attacks on the left if I were to guess. So for instance, maybe you can modify one of your skills to do more damage or deal a different type of damage or heal. We then have a combat scene that doesn't really show us much info before we get to Gustav firing his gun, which is an option we saw earlier. It seems like every shot takes up a mana charge, and you can also see on the creature's left shoulder there seems to be something glowing, which I think is probably a weak spot to hit with the gun, but the player doesn't hit it, so we can't say for sure. The next scene is the first scene where the player is being attacked by the enemy, so there's a couple differences. First and foremost, we can see a brand new party member that we don't have a name for. Also, we can see Celia with a sick double-sided scythe on her back, and I think that mostly shows us that A, new weapons will have new models that you will see in combat, and it also confirms that gearing will be part of this game, although as we'll see later, the devs have kind of already confirmed that too. The most important thing here though is probably on the left of the screen, you can now see a new menu pop up with different button prompts. You can see gradient, parry, dodge, and jump. I have no clue what gradient means in this context, even after trying to translate it from French, but we do have context clues later on in this video that I'll talk about when we see it. The other three options are all pretty self-explanatory though, as ways to avoid damage from the enemy. In this scene we see Mael perform a counter, which does make me wonder what button prompted that, as there's no set counter button on the UI. Maybe a perfect parry results in a counter, but there's really no way to tell right now. After this combat scene we see another pile of bodies, this time zoomed in so we can see that they are turned to stone. We can also see that all the bodies are wearing the same clothes as the characters in this expedition, so we know for sure that these are the remnants of previous expeditions. There's yet another scene change, and in this scene we see another boss fight. We again see a blue 1, then a bright yellow flash on the boss, which I assume is the prompt to hit your dodge button. Then as this boss attacks, Mael successfully jumps and you can see the word jump pop up. Then you can see Mael attack as a counter attack, and then the boss taking fire damage. Going back to the counter system, this makes me wonder if maybe you can counter attack on any enemy if you successfully avoid the damage with perfect timing. Then you see Gustav parrying and you can see a blue 1. This just confirms that the blue 1 does represent a mana gain, but it also shows that on a parry you gain mana. So they are trying to further incentivize you parrying and dodging so you will get more resources. Then in the final combat scene that I want to talk about, we can see Mael performing a gradient counter, and you can see that she gains a mana point for performing the counter. So this might be what the gradient button is for, as this has a much longer animation and does a lot more damage than a normal counter, or at least I think it does. And so maybe it's a button that you press at the end of an enemy's combo, since it has such a long animation, and it rewards you for knowing when the combo ends by allowing you to do bonus damage. But I don't know if that's just from pressing the gradient button, or if the gradient is a modifier to your other buttons. The defensive system seems actually fairly complex in the way that there are some mechanics here that aren't clearly explained just by the UI. Now we are at the end of the trailer, and the final scene is a scene of Mael covered in blood, falling to her knees, grasping to an expedition armband. You can see it is not her own armband, so it is someone else's from the party. Then, after one final cut, we can see that she is kneeling in front of the paintress, which is obviously a bit ominous for the expedition, since she is now at the final destination, but none of the party members are with her. But that's it. That was all that was shown in the trailer. My main takeaway after doing this deep dive is that the combat seems very action heavy for a turn-based game, which I think is intentional. This game will actually probably play closer to a almost rhythm game slash action game than a true turn-based game, which I think is a good thing, as it does help differentiate it from the crowd. Besides that, I think the setting hooked me like it hooked most people. It's an interesting premise. The art direction looks fantastic and a lot of the scenery looks great. But of course, that isn't the end of this video. There are still some things we need to look at on the website. So let's head over there and talk about it a little bit. Here we can see that there will be 6 playable characters and that you will customize them with gear, skills, stats, and character synergies. So we've seen 5 of the characters, and the character synergies thing implies that all of the characters will play slightly differently. This is supported by Gustav's gun, or the stanceless thing we saw in Mael earlier. The other thing on the website that I think we should look at to get a little more information is actually the staff page. The first interesting bit is the creative director's favorite games. His favorite games are Persona 3, Devil May Cry, Demon's Souls, Journey, and Final Fantasy VIII. And I do think you can see some pretty direct inspiration in this game. The game design is very reminiscent of Persona. In fact, that's how most people seem to be describing this game. And the gameplay seems to be trying to blend in action combat with the dodging and parrying and counter mechanics, which of course is more reminiscent of Devil May Cry or Demon's Souls. Finally, there's also the perfect hit system, which is in Final Fantasy VIII. And so I kind of expect to see more inspiration from these games as they kind of show more of the game. Besides the creative director, there's one other position I want to point out, and that is the junior level and quest designer. And so this position tells us that this game will at least have some quests. Now, if he's the only one working on it and he is junior level, I wonder if it's only main quests, although I doubt they would have a junior working on main quests. So I do think it implies that there will be some level of side quests. How many there will be is a question that remains to be seen, but it's one of the things that I'm probably most interested to see next is what is the core gameplay loop of this game. Will it be more linear or will it be a little more expansive? And I think that's really important, especially when it comes to gearing characters, as being able to try out different builds and do side content to get better gear is always one of the things that is a big driver in JRPGs. So in a very linear game, if there aren't a ton of side quests, I could see it starting to become a problem for some people. But of course, at this point, we've entered the world of speculation, but it is something that I'm interested to see more of, and I hope that they show it, if not in the next trailer, then in some sort of gameplay showcase down the road in 2025. There are a few more things to see on the website, like there are some pictures. I think the only interesting picture is you can see Luna, who's the mage, and there's this weird thing on the right side of the screen, which is probably her unique mechanic. There isn't really much else to talk about on the website right now. It's mostly just explaining things that I've already explained to you, but feel free to check it out on your own and support the devs. But the final thing I want to talk about is the name. The Expedition 33 in the title makes sense given the premise of the game, but what is Clair Obscur? So it looks very French to me, and this is a French-made game, so I guess let's plug it into Google Translate and see what pops out. Chiaroscuro? Is that even an English word? Well, let's Google that. Oh, it's an Italian term. Okay, so basically to summarize, the idea of chiaroscuro, or Clair Obscur, is the use of light and shadow to both provide contrast, but also to give depth and volume to the subjects. So I think the gamer way of trying to explain it is it's trying to paint with RTX on. Now I think that obviously making Clair Obscur the title of the game introduces some interesting ideas about what the creators want to convey. I think the classical JRPG interpretation would be that the game focuses on light and dark as an analogy for good and evil, in almost a Kingdom Hearts kind of way. It's also possible that they want to subvert the JRPG trope of making light and dark good and evil by maybe representing the conflict in the game as black and white initially, that is, the paintress is evil, we the humans are the good guys, but slowly providing more detail and depth as the game goes on, in much the same way that Clair Obscur provides depth to paintings. It's something that I am interested in and something I'll probably have to reflect on after playing the game and seeing what the main theme of the game is. The other thing though is, like I mentioned earlier, it also makes me want to look for use of Clair Obscur in the video game. I talked about it when I talked about the Eclipsed Sun, but it's not just that. If you remember, the main antagonist of this story is the paintress, and Clair Obscur is a painting term for light and dark. And you'll notice that you have these bright light numbers on a very dark pillar. And so there's a very direct correlation there between the title of the video game and kind of the core premise of the game. Then once I think you start looking for it, you can kind of see it everywhere. But anyway, that's basically all the information we have right now. This game is the game that stole the Xbox showcase for me and really Summer Games Fest weekend, so I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it, as I still have a ton of questions, as I kind of point out in this video. You know, will there be side quests? Are there hubs? How long will the game be? And I mean, this game looks beautiful, and knowing that it's a small dev team makes me wonder how much time went into the aesthetics versus the gameplay. Mind you, that isn't me saying that I think the game might be bad, more so an open question that definitely I think needs to be answered by the devs going forward in order to set expectations. Speaking of setting expectations, this video came out much sooner than I kind of anticipated, because right after I released my Metaphor video, which you can check out here, I watched the Xbox Gaming Showcase and saw this, so then I felt the need to suddenly go work on my next project. So don't expect me to have a super common release schedule like this, like once a week. I work a day job and I have some other stuff going on. I have a dog now, a bunch of, life stuff. I am definitely more interested in coming back and making more videos. So if you want to see more from me, feel free to subscribe. If you have any comments about anything you saw in the trailer or questions about things I said, feel free to leave a comment. I'm more than happy to explain. I try to respond to as many comments as I can that make sense to respond to. Of course, if you liked the video, feel free to leave a like. And besides that, I just hope you have a good day, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.